Well, the look back is so excited. We have an old friend that I haven't caught up with in a while, so I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We have our guest Kurt Wagner. I worked with Kurt back in the days. It feels like it was 2 years ago. It was probably more like 10 when we
Yeah.
were at Recode. And what a phenomenal run that was. Of course, Kara Swisher and Walt Mossberg. And you were doing a lot of great tech reporting, and you've taken those skills and you're now doing it over at Bloomberg. Kurt,
I,
welcome to the look back.
hey, thank you for having me. It does feel, I don't know, I feel there's been like 10 lifetimes since Recode, I feel. You know what I mean? We
Yeah.
on our second Trump presidency, we had COVID in there. Like it's the tech stories are endless. So it was a great place though. I definitely got a start there, that's for sure.
Well, you know what else has happened since we last spoke? You wrote a book. You got your first book,
Yeah, thank you.
which was on the exciting topic, the battle for the bird.
Yes.
Story of X and Twitter and really all the stuff that's going on there. It has been one of the best soap operas in the tech world, in the business world, in life, because Twitter went from being this little niche social media platform at the dawn of that era to becoming the centerpiece of it, and then the Mercurial founders who started it and their whole progressions into
Right.
into it sort of disappearing, Elon jumping in and making a small $40 billion bet.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing, so a quick backstory,
Yeah.
if I can. I was actually going to write a Twitter book before Elon ever showed up on the scene. So my initial pitch was sort of a Jack Dorsey biography with Twitter and Jack is it's like the story of Jack Dorsey but told through the lens of Twitter, right? Because it was such an interesting story and I thought, well, we'll get to the Trump presidency because that had a lot of interesting moments. We'll get to, the activist investors who tried to oust Jack Dorsey, COVID. There was just I thought there was a lot there. And I'm literally out pitching this Jack Dorsey Twitter book in early 2022. And Elon shows up as the largest shareholder while I am like waving my book proposal around at any publisher who will look at me, right? And so I remember in literally having conversations with one publisher who was like, well, where does Elon fit in? And this was back when he was just going to join the board. And I was like, well, I guess I'll throw him in the final chapter, as like a new board member or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it took me a couple months, honestly, to come to grips with the idea that my original idea had just been like totally lit on fire and that I needed to pivot to where the story was going, right? And it sounds so obvious now, but like in that moment in 2022, I was like, no, I have this great book. I have this great Twitter Jack Dorsey book, and Elon is
Yeah.
like messing it up and obviously had to go where the story went. So I think it worked out for the best.
The proverbial pivot hits
Yeah,
journalism too, right?
it sure does. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, it's also like how lucky, right? As someone who's telling a story to have the world's richest man suddenly show up like in the middle of your story that you're reporting on. I mean, it did make it more crowded. I will say there's several books about this saga that are out there, not just mine. Which is a bit of a bummer, but I mean, the story itself just got so interesting so quickly with Elon in the mix. So I think overall, I think I lucked out having him show up the way he did.
You did dig in a lot. You did some great research in the book, and you talk a little bit about the Trump situation and the Elon situation. You reveal a lot about Dorsey. I mean, that whole team at Twitter at the beginning, that was just so phenomenal how that came into existence and then how it grew.
I think one of the interesting things about Twitter that existed the entirety of the company's existence before it morphed into X was just like the way that Twitter sort of punched above its weight, right? Like I mean, this is a company that I think a lot of people would talk about in the same sentence as Facebook or YouTube or fill in the blank.
Yep.
But from a business, it was like 1/20th the size of Facebook. You know what I mean? Like it was nowhere close to the business success that Facebook was. And yet culturally, it sort of was right there in that same conversation. And so I think for me, one of the reasons I think Twitter is such a weird and interesting story is that it really did achieve this like cultural relevance that outpaced the actual business itself. And I think that was one of the reasons, quite frankly, that like it struggled and why Elon was able to come in and do what he did was that it didn't have the foundation um, in the way that like a Facebook did to protect itself.
Right. I think the other part to it, it's just the content, the user generated content on that site just
Yeah.
had edge.
Yeah, I mean, think about the Trump presidency, the first one, right? Like
Mhm.
obviously a lot of this was very controversial at the time and probably still is, but you had like a sitting US president sort of like pseudo threatening nuclear war to North Korea, like on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, hey, my button's bigger than your button and you better watch out. Otherwise, you won't be around much. And it's like, holy smokes. Like
True.
like, how did this particular platform become the place for that type of exchange? Right. And I think, and that's obviously one dramatic example, but I think to your point, like, there's some crazy stuff that's happened on Twitter over the years, and it's all public, and it's just yeah, again, culturally way
We're,
outpunched its weight there.
we're talking about so I want to stay on that, but I want to go into your role there. The thought that Twitter has evolved, but it still remains that polarizing playground for opinion and commentary. But to the point where you see it challenging and replacing journalism? Is it augmenting journalism? How do you view a site like Twitter? Because there's this whole hubbub, Elon led, thrust against what he calls legacy media.
Yeah,
In a way, I guess Bloomberg would be considered in that mix.
for
But
sure.
if you think about Bloomberg still doing cutting edge digital, cutting edge TV, cutting edge print, I mean, all these other assets.
I
Um,
think of yeah, I think of legacy media less about like the literal uh medium with which the media is distributed, right? Like whether it's video, podcast, television, and more just like is this a newsroom full of like real journalists that have been around for a while and trying to challenge, people in power, right? And like Bloomberg certainly qualifies in that regard. And I think, Twitter, I have sort of two thoughts on Twitter and the news environment. I mean, the first is like pre Elon. I think there's no doubt that Twitter had a huge impact on the way journalism evolved, right? I mean, the ability to break a story on Twitter and watch that news sort of go viral in real time was just, I mean, that was like a drug to journalists. You know what I mean? Like it was something special if you could break a story and the minute, you had a link to share, it was like it's up on Twitter. You're trying to watch that thing go viral.
yeah.
That changed, I think, the pace of journalism. I think it changed sort of the almost the bar of what constitutes a story. And that's where every journalist hung out and spent their time. I think post Elon, it's a very different experience. It's a very
Yeah.
different experience as a journalist. Not only do I find there's fewer and fewer sort of traditional, professional journalists there, but the decision by Elon to remove the blue check marks, I'm sure you'll remember he eliminated the verification badges. One of the first things he did, it really just made it difficult to understand who you're hearing from, right? The news value as a consumer on Twitter went way down because you just don't know, like, is this a real person? Is this a real journalist? Do they really work at the New York Times or Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal? And because you don't have that element of that verification element, I just think it's less trustworthy. And so as a result, I certainly use it a lot less for news than I did a few years ago.
Right. And we also have an interesting trend percolating too, where a lot of those people that would go to X now to break their news, they're now creating their own channels on places like
Right.
YouTube, Substack. And it's really quite phenomenal how top reporters, media experts are moving into other roles. And a lot of them are independent creators leaving the Washington Post or other large, significant places because they disagree with some of the rules, or maybe they're just doing it on their own to be entrepreneurial. Time for me to go do something different. Or maybe I do have a problem with Bezos or Musk or somebody else
Right.
what to write or not write. Whatever the case may be, it's kind of a fascinating time in the world of journalism.
I think so. I think everyone's probably got a different reason for striking out on their own, right? Whether it's the management or the pay or the just the freedom, the flexibility. Um, I certainly have a high level of respect for my industry colleagues who are willing to bet on themselves, right? I think that's a pretty cool thing to say, hey,
Yeah,
I'm good enough at my job. I have a big enough brand. I'm able to deliver news that people want, and I can do this without sort of a formal newsroom behind me. And I think for it's not going to work for everybody, of course.
yeah.
But being willing to bet on yourself like that is something that I think is impressive. I obviously have not done that. I'm still at Bloomberg. I've been here almost 6 years, and very happily, uh, hope to make it 7 plus. But I think for me, not only is there a fear, like if I were to consider this, right, there would be like, okay, there's a fear, one that you just don't have the support and resources that you get with a full newsroom, right? Like I'm so lucky. Like I hear a tip, I get a story idea. I have great editors that I can pick up the phone and call and bounce that off of. I have colleagues in other industries like, hey, if I'm hearing a tip about a deal, I got a whole deals team at Bloomberg that can help track that down. Some of the smartest people in the world at their respective beats.
Right.
And I think that's something that you can't get, obviously, if you're out doing your own thing. And then, there's also like, at least in my world, there's some weeks that are crazy and I'm writing like every single day. And then there are slow times too, where you're like, I don't really know, I'm out working on an enterprise or a feature or whatever. Like, the thought of writing, a newsletter 3 days a week, every single week, no matter what is going on in the news cycle,
Yeah.
is a daunting thing because, to be honest, like not every week has three newsletters worth of things going on if you're narrow enough in your focus. So anyway, I guess the short version is respect the people who are doing it. So far, it hasn't been for me, but I think it just goes to show that there's not just one way to be a journalist in 2025. The traditional methods are no longer the only way to do this job.
And that's a great point. And particularly in this times where now you have this threat that AI is going to come in and wipe out a bunch of other writing jobs
Sure.
and creative jobs. And now we see the opposite, almost like more channels opening up for more people that really enjoy doing journalism still.
I think
So
so.
it's
Yeah.
pretty cool in a way. Like you can go to 5 or 6 different places to get your so-called newsletter or your podcast or your other kinds of content, desires fulfilled. And if it's good enough, it'll find a marketplace because there are enough tools out there. AI will, I guess, supplement that.
And I
Anyway,
think, but I,
oh, go
I,
ahead.
I do think the business element of this, and this is not something I spend much of my time day to day thinking about, but obviously as a journalist in this industry, you can't ignore just like the sort of unbundling, if you will, like if you want to use a cable example, right, and think of all of these substacks as individual channels or whatever. Um, it's there is a question about like what the business of journalism looks like moving forward, and obviously everyone's trying to get into subscriptions. But as a news consumer, like you can only pay for so many things, right? Like you're not going to have 20 news subscriptions. You might have one, two, three. Just like I'm a Netflix subscriber, and I'm what else do we even do?
YouTube.
I do Disney Plus. My kids love the Disney stuff, but like I don't have Hulu. I don't actually have HBO. Doesn't mean I don't love stuff on there, but like not enough necessarily to pay every month. And so I think the news situation is going through that same thing, right? Like who's willing to pay and how many subscriptions are they willing to get? And the Substack thing only adds to the mix because now not only are you paying for the traditional players, but you want to support your favorite sort of individual or author who's out doing their own thing.
What is your take on? I know you cover Meta, Facebook as well. Was your take when they ruled out the content moderation, got rid of some of those fact checkers as well.
Yeah.
Was that an obvious move you saw, or was that a an apology of some sort?
I have written this before. I mean, to me, a lot of the moves, not just those ones, but those ones in particular, are examples of this company really pivoting toward the incoming administration and trying to align as closely as possible with, President Trump. And think about 4 years ago, or I guess 5 years ago at this point, when Trump was still in office that first time around, like what was the biggest headache for Meta? Well, it was that they were fact checking the sitting president of the United States all the time, right? He was tweeting about or posting about COVID. He was posting about the election, ultimately the election, results. And so if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you're sitting there going, that was a pretty miserable year. 2020 was a pretty miserable year to be running Facebook because you're fighting almost daily, if not weekly, with the sitting president. So what's one way to avoid that? Well, you loosen the rules. You loosen the rules around what people can say. You get rid of the fact checking altogether, right? So that he's no longer calling your office and complaining. And I can't really think of obviously they frame this as like, oh, we want to return to our roots around free speech and things like that. But like a lot of the stuff they're letting people say again is it's not, in my opinion, like this massive free, like, oh, I wasn't allowed to say what I really want. It's like, it's kind of hateful stuff, right? And it's like, even with fact checking, they rarely, if ever, like, I shouldn't say rarely, they didn't always remove stuff. Sometimes they would just label it, right? Like, hey, this is inaccurate. Like, here's a label to more information. I guess to me, this feels very much like a an adjustment to kind of make the president of the United States feel like they are on the same page versus anything else.
Which is somewhat unprecedented. I can't think of another sitting president that had that kind of influence over the media.
I mean, I do think people probably pivot a lot more to appease administration, like probably every 4 years type of thing. But it does feel more dramatic because of the scale it's happening on, because of the personalities involved, right? Donald Trump and Mark Zuckerberg. Like, I can't think of anything either, to be clear. I'm not saying this is just like, oh, this is just regular par for the course, but I think the idea that people would try to align with an incoming administration makes sense to me.
Mm.
It's just like the level at which it's happening and the public nature in which it's happening that I think is has struck people in a very interesting way.
Yeah, really curious. Again, love getting your thoughts on this, Kurt. Before I jump off, though, tell me what the
Yeah,
whole experience was on the book.
yeah.
How was it writing your first book, then getting it published and getting on the road and promoting it and doing all that stuff?
Yeah. I would say w- way more work than I ever envisioned, and I thought I was prepared. I talked to a bunch of people who had written books, and they told me it'll be a lot of work, and I was like, "Yep, don't worry, I'm prepared for that." And I somehow was not. It was just an absolute avalanche of work. That being said, the 3 months I took for book leave, so Bloomberg, very lucky, gives you 3 months to go
Wow,
write your book, and they continue to pay you,
wow.
or at least they did with me, which was great.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Was like my favorite 3 months of my professional life, probably, right? Because you're still working a lot, as I just mentioned. Like, you're still getting up and putting in full days, and oftentimes very late nights. But the ability to just have that control over your schedule and your time, as someone who is used to living in the news cycle, when stuff happens and you just like have to drop everything you're doing and
Right,
run toward it,
right.
was so nice. I would like wake up and drop my son off at preschool and like go to the coffee shop and write till I just didn't want to write anymore. And then I would go home and go for a run and pick it back up later that afternoon. It was just like the flexibility of controlling your own time was
Did you
really great.
develop more discipline as a result of this, or were you pretty disciplined on in terms of your writing scheduling and
I'm a relatively disciplined writer to begin with, but sort of a fun story. My book manuscript was due, and my second child, our daughter, was her due date was 5 days later. And so I had a
double deadline?
deadline. I had a deadline imposed on
Right.
myself that was very strict because we'd already had one child, so I knew what we were getting into. And I was like, as soon as this baby comes, like, I'm not going to be able to write anymore. Right. Like this. So if I don't get it turned in on time, it's like a 5 month delay basically. So I was like very, very diligent and got it turned in on time, which was great. But I definitely had some external forcing factors there to
Yeah.
help me get there.
You had an early warning sign of your new deadline.
I sure did. Yeah. So it was great. I loved it. People, get this question all the time. Hey, are you going to write another book? Um,
Yeah, the sequel's already is out
I
there
was gonna,
already.
well, I was going to say, so I would love to write another book. I love the experience. I thought it was awesome professionally. It's very cool to hold something like, hold a book and be like, these are words that I wrote. I think that's just like a very fulfilling experience as a journalist and a writer. That being said, like the topic needs to be something you're willing to eat, dream, sleep, think about 24/7. Like it is all consuming. I would literally dream about this book, this story, these people. And so I would need to find a topic that I'm like willing to have consume my life for 2 years minimum, right? In order to pursue another book. And I don't know what that topic is right now, but
Yeah.
I don't have anything at the moment.
I was gonna say the whole Elon and X thing is and how that morphs into greater power is
Yeah.
is a hot topic. The metamorphosis of Mark is kind of an interesting topic as well. But I think what you're doing in terms of the cross tabul with the AI tidal wave. Now, a lot of people are going to cover it, but there's so many
Yeah.
threads in that. Isn't it a fascinating time between
Totally.
the mega monopolies that are all going to war? I mean, this is way beyond what we saw in SaaS or networking or the PC era, where we thought there were big companies competing with each other. This is at a whole nother level in scale.
Yeah. I was going to say the scale is what's crazy, right? I mean, we're
Yeah.
writing about um, Meta this year, for example, announced their capital expenditures for the year are going to be as high as $65 billion, right? And I you kind of say that, oh, it's like, oh, they're going to spend 65 billion on AI, and like really think about that, right? Like $65 billion. I mean, these companies are worth more than $1 trillion, right? So like the scale, the financial scale, also you see some of the stuff that's coming out and it's like science fiction spooky, right? Like it's very cool, but it's also alarming sometimes, like the things that AI can do. And so I think when you combine the money, the personalities, and the actual like output, the technology itself, it's like quite a combination I'm not sure we've seen before.
It's kind of interesting too on a couple points. One, an old guy like me, I look at this and it's like IBM is a second tier player
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
whole battle. And in a way, they kind of invented the space, maybe is a 1.0 or 1.1 with Watson and stuff. I mean, I know AI has been around for a long time, but kind of funny, they're a side player. And then the whole layer of countries competing.
Right. With like China and DeepSeek and all this stuff. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, it's a true,
Russia, US.
yeah, it's
It's
a truly global, it's a global race. I mean, we saw, Vice President JD Vance, like one of the first things he did was go to Europe and basically like, talk about how Europe is threatening the future of AI because of regulation and all this. Like it's I think it's one of those times where it's like every company is working in the same general space, right? Like for a long time, Google had search and Apple was doing phones and Facebook was doing social networks. And like, yeah, there were overlaps, but it felt
everyone
like
had
everyone had their own lane,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I think maybe that's the difference now is like everyone's in the same lane and running in the same direction. And so that's unique. And that's what makes it interesting.
So in 3 to 5 years, do we see massive consolidation, or do we see all of these players really still, not all, but most of these players still finding a way to coexist and partner like we are in the cloud world, where
Yeah.
how many people really went out of business, but there's a layering effect. Are you
Yeah, I'm
a
not entirely sure, but like it's getting so expensive that the cost is going to force people together, right? Like we just had a story publish at Bloomberg a couple hours ago that Meta's out trying to raise tens of billions of dollars from investors to help fund its AI efforts. I was talking to Apollo about a $35 billion financing package, and it's like, if Meta, a $1 trillion company, is out there saying, "Hey, we need help to finance this thing," right? And we're seeing Microsoft and OpenAI team up, and that there will be more, right? Like there will inevitably be more of these sort of deals because the money is just so big, um, that it's hard not to imagine it consolidating, right? Like maybe all the players will still be relevant, but they'll all be sort of working on the same things. I look, I shouldn't predict because what do I know? But it just feels
So what
like
do
we're
you think
getting
here,
to a
Kara
stage.
Swisher or Walmart?
Kara would have already made a prediction by now. So
Exactly.
yeah.
I know, and you tend to know her favorites, but I think it is interesting. You can't predict today. It would be impossible to. You
No,
could
no.
handicap this thing. We could throw a few dollars at it, and maybe there is a betting app for this. Uh, but
Yeah.
but I'm not confident about any money I'm throwing down. Just like I wasn't confident on, betting who's going to win the NBA title this year.
Sure. And I think that's what makes it interesting though, right? Like if we all knew who the winner was going to be today, it wouldn't be an interesting story. But I do think we're seeing partnerships, we're seeing investments in each other's businesses, et cetera. I don't think that's going to go away. I just don't know who's going to ultimately, like, are there going to be 10 large language models that rule the world in 5 years, or are there going to be three? I really don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, kind of early innings still, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, definitely.
What else are you spending some time on, Kurt, watching? I know you have your specific beats, but what other
Yeah.
interesting topics you digging
Well, we're
in?
spending a lot of time right now thinking sort of in the short term, we're thinking about TikTok because that's a
Yes.
company that I help cover as well. And
Yeah.
there's a looming ban that's coming up in April. And that's a super interesting story too, because it's not just a TikTok story, it's a geopolitics story, right? It's about a
Yeah.
global trade war and China, and there's ramifications, right? If this thing gets shut down, Meta and YouTube and even Snap or X, like there's a lot of people who stand to benefit from a major player like TikTok kind of being wiped off of the battlefield here. So I'm spending a lot of time doing that. Spending a ton of time thinking about Elon Musk. Not only because of the experience I had writing the book about his Twitter takeover, so I sort of have that lens, and I still cover X, but just really thinking about like what he's become in terms of a force within U.S. politics and global politics, and um, it's crazy, man. Like the number of businesses that he has, the influence that he has on almost
He's
every
sitting in on
sector.
cabinet meetings, man. He's
Yeah, literally speaking at cabinet meeting. Not just speaking, but the very first person to be called on at
had to
a, at
let him.
a
Yeah, he spoke.
cabinet meeting.
Yeah, he spoke.
So, yes, I would say, you know, outside of my normal beat, which is Meta, TikTok, X,
Mhm.
the other thing taking up most of my brain power and time right now is literally just Elon Musk and the role that he's
Seriously,
playing
could you
in the
could you
world.
could you pick any hotter topics or soap operas
I
you've been
know.
reading and chronicling as a journalist?
So this is what I tell myself because there are certain weeks you can imagine, Keith, where I'm like, this sucks. You know what I mean? Like, oh, it's just a long week. It was exhausting. It was like, every time you turn your head to the right, something happens over on the left. But I keep reminding myself, like, I am covering, like, would I walk away from getting to cover these things in this moment? And the answer is like, no way, right? Like, if you're a journalist and you want to feel like you're covering the most important things in the world, what better kind of story to be chasing right now, especially at a place like Bloomberg that has a global reach the way that we do. So
Amazing.
it's a good job. It is hard, but it's a very good job. I'm very lucky.
I was going to tease you and say, is Bloomberg going to buy TikTok? So what happens to it though? Do you have a handicap there?
I don't, but I'll tell you that we ask other smart people this all the time, and I truly think it's a toss up. Like even smart people that are high ranking in the tech industry that have better insights than I would. Like they have a Rolodex that's better than mine. Even those people are like, I don't know, like it feels like a true 50-50 situation. I think um, there's just so many factors, right? Like if this was a very traditional sales process, I think we could have a better handicap here because we could say, well, we know this is what usually happens in this moment. But what usually happens is basically tossed out the window because you have Trump who's trying to involve himself in whatever deal. You have the Chinese government and the role that they will inevitably play in a deal if it happens. You obviously have the price tag, which is going to be tens of billions of dollars. It's not like the kind of thing that everybody can buy. So there's a very limited number of potential buyers to begin with.
Yeah.
It's just a super interesting story right now. And if I were to tell you, here's what's going to happen, I'd be lying to you because I truly don't know. But I think there's a good chance it goes away. I don't. It's certainly not like I wouldn't say it's like a 10% chance. I'd say it's much higher than that.
Yeah, it's a government issue, it's a political issue, it's a business issue, who knows? So let's end on an interesting a side note too, because we just talked about, your day to day and your role there
Yeah.
at the prominent Bloomberg Media Center and your role as a tech reporter. I come out of Jade School, general assignment reporting stuff. You've done a lot of work as a reporter, writer. I mean, I thought this career might be headed toward the graveyard as a journalist, as a writer, confidentially, candidly. I mean, it's kind of interesting. What would you say to the Kurt Wagner who's going into college today that
Oh
was
gosh.
thinking, yeah, was thinking about like maybe I want to be a journalist or maybe I want to be a writer or maybe you're, sort of mid,
Yeah.
heading out of college, may not want to explore. Do you think it's worthwhile to go into journalism school? Or maybe explore some other backgrounds and then
Yeah.
explore your writing.
Well, I hope people still find it worthwhile, right? I mean, it'd be a bummer if like people don't want to do this job anymore because I do think it's so incredibly important. I think it's a tough sell right now, right? Because you have not only the threat of like AI, right? And like, oh, like AI is just gonna do all the writing, but you have people at the top, especially in this country, who are attacking the institution of journalism every single day, right? And that's President Trump and Elon Musk. And so, if you're 20 years old in college and thinking, what do I want to do with my life? I can understand why some people might be reluctant to go down this path. But I hope good people do because what I will say about the AI, and again, what do I know? But like AI right now is great at summarizing stuff that exists, right? Like you give it 10 million words and say, hey, like summarize this into 5 paragraphs and it'll do it for you.
Yeah.
Um, but AI can't go report the news, right? Like AI is not going to go out and do interviews. AI is not going to go out and sift through um FOIA documents and try to hold people accountable in ways that I think true journalists do. So I'm somewhat hopeful that even if the actual writing maybe becomes easier because of AI or automated, that the journalism behind the writing will still need to be done by people who are willing to put in the time and the effort. So that's one thing. And then for people who have decided they want to do this, my advice, and actually this is somewhat top of mind because I got to speak at a journalism class at Cal Berkeley a few weeks ago, which was really cool.
Yeah.
Um, and I shared this advice too. Like my the thing that I did best, I would say, when I first started was just write. Like I actually wanted to be a sports reporter. I was like obsessed with Sports Illustrated. I thought like, that's where I'm going. I'm going to be a feature writer for Sports Illustrated. And someone, I wish I could remember who, but someone basically gave me the advice like just go get a byline. Like just write. Don't worry about the topic.
Yeah.
Don't worry about, you know, um even as much as like where it's showing up. Learn how to write, learn how to be a journalist, learn how to do interviews, and you can switch topics later on, right? Like if you are a good reporter and a good journalist, you can go be a good journalist in different industries down the road. But if you're so pigeonholed on like, well, I'm only ever going to write sports because that's what I want to do, like
Yeah.
that just might not open, that door might not be open at that time, right? It's all about timing. And so I took that advice. I started writing business, even though I that was not necessarily where I foresaw, like, my dream job. And I'm so glad I did, right? Because I think it got me down this path that's worked out really well.
Yeah, the technology, sports, and entertainment industries have all blossomed really well in the world of media. So you just have to
Yeah.
be fortunate, kind of, to pick the right segments. But
Yeah, and I would like to think, obviously, um, but I would like to think that, like, my skills as a business journalist, like, I could apply those to, if I wanted to go cover sports someday,
yeah,
maybe there's a way in because of everything I've done in this sector, right? And so yeah, so that was what I told those students, and what I would tell anyone who says or believes, journalism's a good path for them, is like, don't be super picky when you're in college or coming out of college. Like, go learn the craft, worry less about the topic, and then you can pivot from there.
Kurt, let's leave it there because one, I took way too much of your time already, but that's the kind of insights I wanted to share. I love the feeling like if somebody's listening to this and got to hear you share that and the stuff that you work on a day-to-day basis, I think they're excited about their future because the stories like the ones we're expressing today don't seem like they're going away.
No, they're not. As much as some weeks I wish they would, they're not going anywhere.
Exactly.
So I appreciate you having me. Thank you. I said this before we got on, but like, such a thrill to get to talk about the book and my work. I'm very proud of it, and hopefully people will give it a shot if they haven't read it before. It's a good read, especially relevant right now with everything happening.
It's a great read, and they should continue to read your stuff on Bloomberg and watch you on Bloomberg. It's been fantastic. Thanks for your time again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.